Almost noon. So good day, everyone. Hi, I'm Viet Nguyen. I'm the technical director for Da Vinci. I'm a physician informaticist, and my role in Da Vinci is to kind of help shepherd the projects and the use cases that we're working on in Da Vinci through to delivering reference implementations and implementation guides. So since at least a good number of you weren't here in the last hour where I gave the overview of Da Vinci, I'm just going to give the really short version of the overview of Da Vinci. It's a payer, provider, vendor-led collaboration under the auspices of HL7, focused on value-based care use cases. And we have some of the largest payers in the country involved, the major EHR vendors, and we have some providers, and we're actively trying to recruit more providers. Da Vinci is working in parallel with the ONC payer-provider FHIR task force, where we will focus on specific use cases around value-based care, and the P2 FHIR task force has a bunch of tiger teams that will focus on scalability of FHIR around identity, directories, API discoveries, et cetera, et cetera. And so many of the things that we're going to focus on in our use cases will have reference to what ultimately the P2 FHIR task force will recommend. So Da Vinci, the goal is to provide information around value-based care and payer and provider and patient needs at the point of care to help reduce the burden of documentation, to provide more efficient care, and help the clinicians kind of do the right thing the first time, and smooth the flow of the information to the payers, and ultimately help support value-based care and reimbursement for the providers. We wanted to create single solutions for these use cases, and hopefully very generalizable solutions as well. But the idea of we have all the major stakeholders at the table, we can create a solution they can agree on, and if they implement it, it obviates the need of doing point-to-point connection. And I don't have to convince you guys of the value of that, hopefully. And Da Vinci really came about because of efforts around HL7's partners in interoperability that brought together payer, providers, and pharma to look for common use cases. And we're bringing those stakeholders together. We want broad participation, which we have. We have experts from this FHIR community supporting us to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with the FHIR paradigm, and using the standard to the best of its ability. But we also recognize, and I'm a pragmatist, that there's the ideal and then there's the real world and getting implementation. So my role is trying to help find that balance between what folks would feel is the right thing to do and what can be done. You have all had to deal with that too, I'm sure. And so we ultimately, with these implementation guides, want to be able to make it so that other adopters, other payers, other providers can pick up an implementation guide and be able to reproduce what we do. That's the great value of FHIR. So we have 3 initial use cases. 2 these are in flight: the 30-day medication reconciliation, as well as coverage requirements discovery. We are initiating the kind of business requirement level discussions on document templates and coverage rules, as well as e-health exchange for HEDIS and STARS quality measures. Actually, later today and tomorrow. So I'm here in Boston for like 7 days, 3 conferences. But so we have a process that we use to build these out, and I'll talk about them. But our goal with each of these use cases are 2 things. One is an implementation guide, and the other is a reference implementation. With respect to the implementation guide, since we are under the auspices of HL7, and we want to leverage the standards process within HL7, as well as have some agility, we have our first 2 use cases are also sponsored through a PSS, project scope statement in HL7. Medication reconciliation is under the Clinical Quality Initiative work group, and the other is under the financial management work group. So we then keep that group informed and have participations from those work groups in our discussions to make sure that there's consistency in what we're envisioning doing and what is acceptable from the standards body. And then as we do the implementation guide and detail that out, we would use the details of the implementation guide to create a reference implementation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to do that here. But the idea with a reference implementation is really just a reasonable demonstration of the functionality described in the implementation guide, the uses of the resources, the profiles, and the operations or transactions. For the smaller projects, like the one I have for medication reconciliation, that'll be pretty straightforward. For some of the larger projects, coverage discovery being one of them, we might have example cases. So briefly, medication reconciliation is a process done by a clinician to reconcile the list from the patient's discharge medication list with their last outpatient medication list. The clinical value is that we want the provider who's going to be continuing the care of the patient to know exactly what the patient has been on and is supposed to go on to continue with, so that there's no confusion. So there's the clinical value of that. There's also a HEDIS measure, NCQA-defined HEDIS measure around medication reconciliation. It has to be done within 30 days of discharge. And the payers today have a myriad of ways of trying to manually get this list to the providers and get them to do it. Providers can report it using a CPT code that has like a 1 cent cost or a 0 cent cost, and that's how the payers are finding out that it's done. The problem is the delay in the revenue cycle process may delay the opportunity to get that reconciliation done. So the idea is we want to not only get it done earlier, but be able to capture that it's done so that the payer knows and can intervene if they're running out of time. Coverage requirements discovery is, think of it as a kind of pre-prior authorization activities where we want to build the opportunity for providers when they know they want to do request a service like a referral or a procedure or a study, they can do send information to a payer and request any documentation they need to fill out, whether it's beneficiary coverage, a specific form, or ideally even electronic form when they go to do that order, to decrease the time it takes today where a patient, I may have to bring a patient back to get more information. Had I known I needed to collect that information, I would have done it at the time of care. So reducing burden there. So here's a sample timeline of what we're going to do. So we identify a project, one of those 9 projects initially. We assemble a team. The team is a combination of member in-kind resources, including subject matter experts from the payer and the provider organizations and the EHRs that understand the business workflow of whatever use case we're doing, understand the clinical needs with the goal of we need to understand that so that we can come to a set of data requirements and an understanding of how the EHR might do this kind of task today, and if they don't do this type of task today, how they might support this kind of task. Once we assemble the team, we do requirements gathering, typical, again, data requirements, workflow requirements, and we articulate that. And then the team works somewhat in parallel. The IG work tends to be a little bit ahead of the reference implementation work, but with the IG work, we take those data elements and we do a FHIR gap analysis. And what we do in that gap analysis is we look at the data requirements. So we all need patient, in this. And so we look and say, does the base patient resource have what we need? Are there profiles already existing on the patient resource, on a resource we need? And often we will go to the US core and look at US core and say, based on our data requirements, does US core fulfill them? And if it has extra, we don't profile that out. We don't constrain that out. We just say it's extra data. But if it doesn't, we would potentially need to add extensions. And if US Core doesn't support it, then we look at one of the other base resources and profile on that. Once we do the gap analysis, we would then model it. We talked about modeling it in either Forge or in Trifolia or in ClinFire and start mocking up some data see does this data make sense? Does the bundle that we want to build make sense? And then from that provides something for the SMEs to look at and say, oh yeah, they can read. You can reasonably read JSON and say, yeah, I see the birth date and the gender and the subscriber information, and they know that it meets their data requirements. And then that also then provides the developers with a place to start if they're going to start developing the reference application. And so where Da Vinci is on these two use cases, that we're there. So we have identified a set of resources for 30-day medication reconciliation, which I'm much more familiar because I'm leading that one, is we want to package up that attestation as a measure report. And within that measure report have references to things that the payer needs, like patient, practitioner, location, because it's supposed to be done in an outpatient setting, and a task resource. So part of the process, we have these debates and these discussions about what is the right resource to use, and
a quick question.
Sure.
From a practitioner standpoint.
Sure.
Are you using straight up practitioner? Or are you doing practitioner role level? Because I'm just wondering about the location.
Yes.
Business and all that.
Yes. So that is one of those items that we're going to try to resolve by the end of today and tomorrow, because there is opportunity to use one or the other, and so in the discussions we will look at the pros and cons of doing one or the other. I think originally we looked at practitioner, but practitioner role is going to be needed for coverage requirements, and so that'll be available to us. And of course, what we want to do is we want to come up with a set of resources that we can use commonly across Da Vinci use cases and not just specific. So we know coverage is an important one because it's going to be used almost anywhere where you need subscriber information. Does that answer your question? Somewhat.
Yeah, plus you're also looking at organization too.
Yep, and we're looking at organization as well. Yep.
Right.
Yes?
Yeah, do you have an example of how that mapping looks like?
I do, actually. And we have time. Anyone want to see? I have a mock-up of what the IG looks like already. So thanks to Eric Haas, so one of the roles that we have is a implementation guide author. And I didn't have a slide for this, but I wanted to mention that right now, implementation guides are being created by lots of different organizations. And one of the concerns that have been voiced is that the content of the implementation guide from a FHIR standpoint is well defined, but how it appears and what other kind of narrative content, there's a lot of inconsistency. So one of the efforts that we're doing is working with Eric, who's working on this use case, along with Lloyd, who's working on the CRD use case, and with Rick Geimer from Lantana, because we'll be using Trifolia, is to start with that small group, come up with some artifacts, like a table of contents that would be a consistent content for each of our implementation guides, a process around how do we gather this information and help the author by pointing out to the requirements team what content the author needs to put into the implementation guide, as well as a set of tools. Right now, it seems that a lot of the implementation guide writers use a combination of Markdown and XML, and ultimately it gets to the IG publisher, but there's a lot of flexibility upstream. And what we want to do is to start to formalize some of that at a minimum for Da Vinci, but ultimately in a way that we can help educate other people who are going to do implementation guides so that we raise the quality of them, because it's kind of all part of what we're doing in FHIR is kind of democratizing the efforts by educating folks. But we need to be able to provide them, to the extent we can, some standardized processes and tools. Was it, John, were you concerned?
I was going to ask a question on,
sure.
Are you only pulling from HL7 implementation guides, or are you open to implementation guides from IG, which are standards?
I guess my answer would be in the goal of seeing what other people do well. I'm willing to look at anything. But I think what we're trying to do is get to the point where at least FHIR IGs have some consistency. At least Da Vinci FHIR IGs have consistency with, if we can build that best practice, then it goes to other IGs. But I'm happy to learn from folks who are working on.
Well, my question was actually for the earlier part of your presentation about where you were looking for implementation guides that you could leverage versus write. Not necessarily.
Leveraging IGs. Oh, yes, actually, Emma pointed out some things in participating in us that we could potentially adopt. And so, to the extent that our members are aware and know about other IGs and can help us when we do the environmental survey, then yes, we would want to. Yeah.
And on the look and feel, IG is investigating similar publication mechanisms.
Yeah. So and that work is ongoing right now. We're trying to, because of the differences in how people use the process and the tools they use, we're trying to get them to kind of come together with some common way, allowing them the flexibility in these early use cases to get the work done, but ultimately trying to get to the point where we can have smart analysts who understand and are proficient in FHIR be able to take this kind of package. We do some tutorials, because I'm thinking about this as a tutorial. How do you train IG authors through the whole process so that they not only have good tools, but they understand what's the good content that goes into an IG. So this is an example. The MRP use case is actually not just medication reconciliation. It's part of a larger PSS that looks at measure reporting in general and how we can use FHIR. And so the PSS has us outlining kind of three approaches of a strict post when during an event, a get, and a pub sub. And measure report is kind of layered, because measure report is the container that you deliver the measure report, but is actually based on a definition of a resource, a measure resource, and that measure resource may be the measure for profile to colon cancer screening, say. And within that measure resource is a library resource that contains CQL. And that CQL defines how do you gather the data to support that resource. So are you going to use an observation, a procedure, et cetera, recognizing that CQL may be not implemented in an EHR, but that they can translate that CQL to whatever that EHR, how they would gather that information. So this is part of the broader kind of measures paradigm that NCQA is trying to do. So, so we have three methods. We define now a workflow. I know this is iStrano Vision, I don't expect you to see it, but we kind of some preconditions. We assume for this use case that the clinicians already have the medication list in whatever way they do today in the EHR, PDF, electronic through a CCD, or they're using the same EHR that they're using in the inpatient setting, but that they do this act of reconciliation. And that the EHRs have an ability for them to confirm that they've reconciled. And when that happens, it kicks off a series of transactions where they'll assemble the message bundle for measure report, post it to the payer. The payer validates that the bundle is valid from FHIR, parse out the initial patient coverage information and validate and confirm that it's their patient, because right now without a directory, we're going to use endpoints, hard-coded endpoints, a list of endpoints. But once they know it's their patient, they would then validate their subscriber and then ingest the data and then use it however they're going to use it. Like, I can kind of understand how EHRs use clinical data, writing orders and displaying labs, but what we're discovering is there are lots of different ways payers use the data and how they store it. So that's kind of a black box. And it's important that because we're under ANSI and antitrust, that's where special sauce comes in, and we don't ask them to expose that special sauce. We're just defining the FHIR on the other side. And in the reference implementation, we'll mock up, if you're going to request a head CT, you send this information. We'll make some simple rules to create the response. And so let's see what else here. So we have these are some of the other approaches to the GET. And then within here is the medication reconciliation. And so we're looking here at what resources are supported in what versions. We're only going to do version 3 and version 4. Initially, we talked about supporting DSTU2, but there was significant limitations, and it seemed like the EHR vendors are really working towards implementing version 3 and going forward. So here's a little graph created using ClinFire, and if you were here in the last 2 days, me talking about ClinFire, these are one of these graphs that you can create with ClinFire. And our goal today, now that we have the profiles defined, is to use ClinFire and, where necessary, handcrafting these examples. So these are our activities for the next couple of days. These are the resources we're going to use. This is an example of the bundle. So right now, this isn't going to be the final IG, but it's just in draft so that we can then provide it to our members to say, is this we know what we have to support in the IG publisher, the required components. Where are we going to add the narrative information to help the implementers understand these sections? So MRP supports observation and measure report as kind of the container resource. And then we'll have examples and terminology and the capability statements. So these are all part of some of what we're developing. So I'm going to go back here.
So what do you do if there's isn't resource that addressing one of your questions? Like I think for coverage, you will have the STU3 supporting coverage.
Yeah, STU3 is in coverage is in 3. Yeah.
In that table, there's like yes, no, and it says no.
Knows whether it was in like U.S. core.
Yeah, it's not U.S. core. Yeah. So again, we want to reuse profiles whenever possible, extend them if necessary, and create new if really necessary.
It's a good point though. Like there were two rows in that table that had no in all 3 columns, and that was coverage and measure report.
And they're not I think they're also not implemented.
Right.
So.
That's the risky part.
Yeah. And so this. Does everybody know who Isaac is? He's with Epic. Great collaborators. That's why we have to have the EHR vendors at the table, because there's going to be a balance between what they support today, what can be reasonably added to their roadmap as a committed member of Da Vinci, and when we can see these implemented in a pilot. And that's part of where we see having provider organizations with this FHIR expertise that understand how, or are certified and understand how to work with both the Epic side of the transactions and the FHIR side, and potentially create their own kind of interfaces that we could then share. Does that seem? I'm looking at Utah. I know you know our experience with Utah. So, so we create the IG. We go through the HL7 process around reviewing it, doing the quality aspects of it. And then our goal for these two is to, we intend to ballot it at the September meeting. So it has to be done by, we have an intent to ballot in mid-July, and the ballot has to be submitted in the middle of August, I believe. And then we'll be bringing the reference implementation to the Connectathon in September and testing it out there. So some of the things that we're using the HSPC sandbox, because it's a vendor-neutral sandbox. It allows for multi-tenant usage. You can collaborate. You can create personas and scenarios. And it has a mock kind of a EHR launch scenario. It supports CDS hooks and Smart on FHIR. So we'll use that to the extent we need to demonstrate, but it's not a requirement necessarily. We chose to use the Lantana Trifolia workbench for our profiling. They support version 3 and have committed to doing the interim builds of R4 so that we can try to keep ahead with the profiling. And then for the Connectathons, we'll be using Aegis's Touchstone product to do testing and create test scripts. We have a Confluence site, which is currently under build, which will allow the public to see what we're doing. But if you want to kind of understand where we are, personally, my responsibility is not to is to the Da Vinci members and then to HL7 and the work groups. So if you're involved in HL7 and involved in CQI, it's a good way to kind of see how the work's going, because we're going to report to them pretty regularly. And we have a Zulip chat stream. No, we don't. But so questions? We have some time. Yes, sir.
Quick question. So, are you aware of the CAQH core initiative?
Which one?
The core operating rules phase 4.
We have some folks. We were in discussions to have NCQA and QH Core getting involved in this, but right for now, their involvement isn't directly through into Da Vinci. It's through the work groups and their involvement in the work groups.
Because some of the transactions that they were proposing,
Mm-hmm.
like the 277 RFAI, they almost seem kind of similar to
I would agree. We try to find. It's a challenge, I think, in any of these. Excuse me. Is having the right number of people in the discussion, so it's a productive discussion, and not too many people that the discussion gets bogged down. And it's a challenging balance, and I'm sure you all have had to tackle that as well. Other questions? Sorry. Really? Yes.
So do you have recommendations for providers that aren't using FHIR yet, like how to get up to speed so they can participate in Da Vinci?
Broadly, having them come to bringing their technical teams to meetings like this. So starting with understanding FHIR in general, and then I think getting involved in these kind of projects where you have to make it real. So, figuring out your EHR and having the conversation with your EHR provider, and finding out what resources they have to support that. So to me, they're really it's a challenge right now, because the EHR providers have made FHIR and U.S. Core available, but that doesn't mean that the hospital system has that internal IT expertise to do much with it.
Right, we don't,
Yeah.
and we have a whole, we're on a Cerner platform,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm trying to think today, scratching my head, why am I the only one here from Christian Care? Because we should be really interested in partnering with Cerner and starting those integrations.
Sure.
So,
And I think that's definitely an important approach. I'll do a shameless plug for the Health Services Platform Consortium, which is they do the sandbox, but it's actually an organization that has provider systems in there to try to help provider systems get up to speed, not only on FHIR, but they talk about business process modeling, and they work on the CIMI models for clinical information modeling. The CIMI is Clinical Information Modeling Initiative. So that's a good place for provider organizations to get involved. But it is challenging because the hospital systems have so many priorities, and FHIR may not be rising to the top quite yet. But it definitely has, because I've noticed in the conversations I've had with C-suite folks is I don't have to bring up FHIR. They ask, which is great. Yes, sir.
I have a twofold question. One is payer side, similar to what is the incentive of joining the Da Vinci project for payers, and second is what is the contribution that will be from the payer side if they join with us?
Sure. So I'll get one of my cards. We have a pretty good representation of payers at the moment. So it takes none of us are full time on this, and so we have to prioritize how we do onboarding. And so we're really looking for payers and providers that have that relationship already established. And if we don't have that representation already in the Da Vinci membership, and there are different levels of membership within Da Vinci, from I think there's a $10,000 level all the way up to a premier. It's like $95,000. But what the higher levels allow a payer to do is to sponsor another organization, typically a provider organization, to be part of Da Vinci. So there are different levels, and that helps determine who has a seat at the operating committee or the steering committee. Other questions? Yes. The Health Services Platform Consortium. You can email me about that too. I'm the chief medical officer for them. It's a volunteer. Busy guy.
Is there a meeting this fall?
There is a meeting in Bethesda at the end of August where we're going to talk. If you're involved in registries and the professional organizations, we're going to do a conversation about that. So if you go to hspconsortium.org. Other questions? We'll be able to get you into the lunch line earlier. Thank you very much, everyone.